listening to the Read-Aloud Revival podcast. This is the podcast that inspires you to build your family culture around books. Well, hello there. This is episode 31 of the Read-Aloud Revival podcast. I'm your host, Sarah McKenzie. So happy to be with you here today. I just had the most delightful conversation with our guest, and I cannot wait to share it with you. I think you're going to love her. Before we get to the interview, I did want to mention, if you haven't left a rating or review for the Read-Aloud Revival in iTunes, would you do that for us? It makes a huge difference in how many people find out about the podcast and get the tools and resources they need to build their family culture around books. All you need to do is go to iTunes, search for Read-Aloud Revival. You can rate the podcast with stars. You could leave a one-sentence review, and that's even better. And it just goes a long way toward how many people find our podcast in iTunes and get to start listening. So we really appreciate everybody who takes just a couple minutes to do that. Today's guest loves talking children's literature. She's so passionate about children's books, in fact, that she's been republishing classic and historical children's literature for the last 20 years through her company, Beautiful Feet Books. Books like the Dallaire biographies, the World Books of Genevieve Foster, Albert Marin's biographies, and more. She also designs guides for teaching elementary and secondary students history using award-winning classic and historic literature. And those guides help parents and teachers incorporate classic living books easily throughout their curriculum. She studied children's literature at Simmons College and in 2006 earned a master's degree in children's literature at the Center for the Study of Children's Literature in Boston. She speaks around the country, is a columnist for the Old Schoolhouse magazine, and is someone I had the immense pleasure of meeting earlier this year. So I'm so happy to welcome to the show, Rea Berg. Rea, welcome to the Read-Aloud Revival.
Oh, thank you, Sarah. It's just lovely to be here with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, can we start by having you tell us just a little bit about your family and your work?
Absolutely. Let's see, where should I begin? We are the very delighted parents of 6 children. We have children ages 15 to 35.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's quite the spread.
Yeah, quite a spread. We have 4 biological children. Our oldest is 35, and when our very youngest biological was 15, we went to Ukraine and we adopted 2 little girls. So we are still in the parenting business, and in fact, it's very funny because for the first time in 35 years, my husband and I are empty nesters for 6 full weeks.
Oh my goodness.
Our youngest daughter is a ballerina, and so every summer she goes and does a summer intensive somewhere. So this year she's with Ballet West in Salt Lake City, Utah for 6 weeks, and staying at the university and sleeping in the dorms and having just an amazing experience there. So it's a kind of a wonderful thing to have about 6 weeks of experiencing what empty nesters experience.
Right, yeah.
Who haven't been parenting for quite as long as we have. So it's been really delightful for my husband and I to reconnect in that way.
Very cool. That's so cool.
So back in the 80s, I started Beautiful Feet Books because I was just really falling in love with children's literature. And I thought, boy, if I love these books this much, I just know lots of other parents are going to too. And that was sort of the genesis of it. And from that point, I really started trying to put together curriculum so that parents and teachers could teach history using literature rather than textbooks. So it was just a very small seed of an idea at the very beginning, but then, it grew and grew to this tree where now we publish all kinds of children's books, and we brought back into print, as you mentioned in the introduction, a lot of wonderful classic literature for children. And that's sort of one of the missions that I really love being part of, is just being able to locate these books that have gone out of print and are just absolute treasures and bring them back into print.
Well, it's such a gift for all of us, I think, because we find out about some beautiful, wonderful, enriching book and then find out it's out of print, and then it's either cost prohibitive or just impossible to find them. So
yes. And that's really what happened with our very first, we call it our very first book baby, because it was Leave the Lucky by Ingrid and Edgar Prynne Dallaire. And I had put together just a very simplistic guide for teaching American history using the Dallaire books, in addition to a number of other classics like The Courage of Sarah Noble and The Matchlock Gun, other Caldecott and Newbery award-winning books. And Leaf the Lucky was so difficult to get that people were having to pay $75 to $100 to buy an old copy of it.
Oh, goodness. Yeah.
So we drove this market price up. And of course, this was before the days of internet. So you had to call around to used bookstores and put in a request to see if they could find it for you.
I'm trying to wrap my mind around how much work that would be. Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Yes. So that was what first sort of initiated the idea of, wow, we should see if we could publish this book. And of course, we knew nothing. We were total neophytes to the whole publishing industry. But we actually met with Miss Ingrid and Edgar Perrin, had two sons, Nils and Ulla. And Nils was at the time working for the Clinton administration, and I had been invited to speak in Maryland. So we decided to contact him and see if he would meet with us about publishing his parents' book, Leaf the Lucky. And so it was very fun. I don't know if you're familiar with the book, but there's a beautiful picture of Leif Erikson on the cover of it.
Yes,
when he's about
we have
10
it.
years old.
Yeah.
Okay.
One of yours,
and
actually.
He's got this wild shock of white hair and these bushy white and these, eyebrows and these big, gorgeous blue eyes. And when we knocked on Nils Dolaire's door, his little boy, who was 10 years old, opened the door. And it was like we were looking into the face.
Oh, my goodness.
It was just so fun, Sarah, because it was just like we knew we were in the right place. And of course, Nils and his brother, Ulla, were the models for their parents.
Oh, right.
For many of their books.
Right.
So, and Ingrid Dolaire was originally, she was Norwegian, so she had that connection with the whole, Leif Erikson story. So that was our very first book baby, and we learned a lot in bringing Leif back to life for a new generation, and it was just an amazing journey. And from that point on, we ended up publishing all the Dolaire biographies, and of course, then many other books. But that was really how the whole publishing thing came about. So
very cool. Okay, so where did your own passion for children's literature, where did that come from? Is that something you've always had, sort of like a little flame that's always been burning, or is there something in particular that ignited it?
Well, I think the flame was really there as a child, because I remember being so just enchanted. My parents had a leather-bound book of like old English poetry or something, and I remember just going to bed with that. As a very young child, I probably didn't understand most of what was in there, but I just remember going to bed with a flashlight and just feeling like through the pages of that book, like I entered this completely foreign country, that was just sort of enchanted and mysterious and wonderful. And so that was there, but it was never fed as a child. I wasn't, one of those fortunate ones that was taken to the library every week and had very literate parents that were constantly reading. And so it didn't really come to sort of full flame until I became a mother myself. And actually, even before I had children, I read For the Children's Sake by Susan Schaefer Macaulay. Are you familiar with that one, Sarah?
Yes, I was just telling somebody my absolute favorite book on education ever, and it's one that I reread every single summer. Yeah.
Oh, you're so wise, because to me, it's sort of established an entirely new paradigm for what it means to educate our children. And it's where we get so many of those notions of, the sort of wholehearted child and living books and nurturing the child's heart and spirit in the process of education. Because, if we don't nurture the child's heart and we're just filling their mind with knowledge, then we can essentially create monsters. We really can't. And so I think, making sure that notion of, my most important calling is really to nurture the heart and the soul of this child. And so I think literature is such an incredibly important tool in our toolkit as parents to make sure that we're training the hearts and the minds of our children while we're educating them intellectually, so that there's, just the strength of that. We don't want to create, just intellectual geniuses that, don't have the humanity and the compassion and the empathy that I think we learned so well through the very best books. So the passion was there, or the flame was there, but then it was really ignited when I started having children, and then I just wanted to find the best books for them. And so that was right about the time that Books Children Love came out by Elizabeth Wilson.
Yes. Mm-hmm. That's another favorite of mine.
Yes, and that book was like my Bible. I mean, I took that to the library every week to get books for my children. Mm. And of course, I would always grab some that weren't in her book, and always found out that 90% of those were not worthy of our time or our energy or our focus. And so that made me sort of start developing my own list in addition to what Elizabeth Wilson recommended in her book. And so that was kind of how I started putting together, oh, well, this would be a great book for early American history, and this would be a wonderful book for learning California history. And so eventually over the years, those things just started, accumulating, and some friends encouraged me, you just need to write it all down. You need to write city guides. And you're like, oh, no, you guys can do this. It's easy, I'll sort you out. So anyway, but eventually I succumbed to the peer pressure, and I just we bought our very first computer, and I sat down and started learning what a word processor was and putting together these very simplistic and, in my very limited knowledge guides. But they became very popular very quickly, and that sort of set us on our mission to just make those available. But it's really struck a chord at a perfect time in kind of homeschooling history.
Yeah, I think so, especially I know so many homeschooling families who really want to teach through literature, because there seems to be so many benefits to teaching through literature. Like you were just talking about nourishing the child's heart, and it reminds me, I don't know the Charlotte Mason quote off the top of my head, but I think she has a quote. There's something in one of her books where she says it doesn't really matter how much the child knows, or we shouldn't ask the question, how much does the child know? We should ask the question, how much does he care?
I mean, culturally, when we started homeschooling back in the 80s, the emphasis really was on character building. And I think there's been a shift, and the pendulum has swung, I think, to our demise in a way, to this notion of the intellectual development of the child and academic excellence. And mind you, I'm as much for academic excellence as anyone. But I think when academic excellence leaves this whole notion of character and childhood development, or child development in terms of teaching our children empathy and compassion behind, I think that's where we get this potential for education. Because, I mean, some of your, most notorious white-collar, crime is committed by highly educated people.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And so education really can't be the goal. I think if we keep our goal, the character development of the child, I think the education will come along with it. And I mean, I have 4 adult children now, so I've been, I've seen the fruit of our labors. And I have to say, I am just always so touched and moved by how compassionate my children are, my adult children, in terms of their ability to care for others and to care for the needy and to care for the oppressed and put themselves out there for, people that just need that hand of compassion and empathy. And so I think that literature is just such an important component in that. And honestly, I have to say for myself, I was not raised in a Christian home. And I think, when I look at the lives of people who have had a very rich literature-based education, where literature has been such a major component of their lives and their focus and their worldview, those people are the people that I love to be with. Those are the people that are authentic, they're real, they're still laying down their lives for other people. Even as they age, their focus is not on themselves. It's on how can I still use whatever talents and faculties and gifts that I have to minister to a broken world. And those are the people that I want to pattern my life after. And of course, with all of the, the media blitz on Ghost of the Watchmen, I think it explores that whole notion so much more clearly. We're just putting out another study guide for high school for contemporary American and world history. So I've just finished writing study notes again for To Kill a Mockingbird.
Yes.
And when you look at the character of Scout, and of course the character of Scout is really the character of Harper Lee, and when you look at just how incredibly rich her childhood was in literature and how she was read aloud to from the time, she could remember. I mean, and this is, of course, the fictional character of Scout, but the fictional character of Scout is Harper Lee. There's no question. And the rich literary background of her life enabled her to see racism for what it truly was. Even though she was couched and raised and nurtured in this cultural environment of the South, where racism was just such a part of who you were and how you viewed the world, because her father was constantly pouring into her such a rich literary world, she was able to break out of that and see racism for what it truly was. And that's why the character of Scout is so endearing, because she speaks to us as a child, the wisdom of a child. And so I think that, it's that same notion of what this Haim Gano said and what you said about not how much they know, it's how much they care. That's our goal.
Well, then it puts education in the service of people rather than people making education this sort of almost like a false god or an idol. We're trying to give our children this rigorous education, but when we ask why, well, an education is always to serve people and help them love each other better. Then we get a more clear picture of what that education should be about. And I think that speaks right to what you're talking about here.
Yes, that is such an important point, Sarah. And I think that when we realize the power that literature provides for us, because even for myself as a homeschool mom, homeschool will put you in the fiery furnace quicker than anything in terms of your own character and
the
your
refining
flaws.
Fire for sure.
Yes, and I think that literature, because, like I said, I was not raised in a Christian home, so I didn't have a lot of those character qualities that I think are so essential if you're going to be a homeschool parent. Literature was that. It was that constant reminder to me of what my goal was, not only for my children, but for myself. It's like, I've got to be working on that whole character component in my life simultaneously with my children. And that's why I think literature can call us into account quicker than anything. Because if we're reading the very best books, we're getting those character lessons ourselves all the time.
That's right.
And that really helps to keep us on the straight and narrow, because I think it's so... Especially, homeschool moms, I don't think there's another demographic on the planet that is as busy and whose time is so incredibly precious. Because, you're not only a wife, you're not only a mother, but you're a full-time educator, too. It's just like the constraints on your time and your temperament and everything you are is so extreme. Like, you are really at such a... you are just, the demands of so many people are focused on you. And so I think that's where we have to realize that we've got to be constantly nurturing our spirit if we want this thing to be successful. We can send kids off to Harvard and we can send kids off to, elite colleges and all. But if we really miss the boat in the character department, that is going to become a curse to us. It's not going to be a blessing. There's a really sweet story of a family that they've kind of followed Beautiful Feet books from the beginning, and then, different educational modes and fashions have come and gone. And at the time that they were homeschooling their children, a new paradigm came along where it was just academically super rigorous, and there was an incredible emphasis on memorization, and this is what you need to do if you want your children to get into the best schools and all this stuff. And so her friends were constantly coming to her and saying, oh, so what are you doing for Greek and Latin? And what are you doing for, rhetoric? And what are you doing for, and, just any list of, rigorous academics. And she says, oh, well, we read good books. And then someone else would come along and what are you doing for this? And what are you doing for that? And, oh, well, we read good books. And so that was always her constant refrain for, the peer pressure. So she kept on the road that she felt was the right one for her family, even though she was having to stand against a lot of peer pressure. And lo and behold, her son gets into West Point. All of her friends, their children were burnt out by the time they were done with high school. And a good majority of them didn't even want to go to college because they didn't like education anymore. Mm-hmm. They had lost their love of learning. Her son went to West Point, and it was tough there. It's a military academy, and it's military life, and it's a tough environment, especially for a fine young Christian person. And so, he would call up and sometimes be lamenting to his mom, it's tough here, Mom. Military life is really tough. And she'd go, well, I hope you're okay. And he goes, oh, yeah, I'm fine. I read good books.
Oh, gosh. I love it. Oh, my word.
And it was just like that skill that he learned and the way he learned about life. I mean, he achieved academic excellence, obviously, but he also had this incredible life skill that he took with him. And he knew that when he needed that place of peace and rest and for his soul to be nourished, that he could go to good books and find it there. So I love that story because that's a story that, we got to see sort of walked out and realized. So
that's
please.
so beautiful. And, my friend, one of my very best friends, Misty Winkler, she was homeschooled and so was her husband. So they have this great second generation perspective on homeschooling that most of us don't have, I think. And one of the things she says is that the most formative thing, the most important thing in both her education and her husband's, now from adulthood looking back, they can see that the thing that formed the most was their reading, their free reading, I think is what she says, what they read in their free time. And so that really guides her homeschooling decisions now, is knowing that as much content as you try and dump into your child's brain, the most formative thing is going to be the connections they make with the stories they read. So kind of same.
Yes. And that's the thing, because, stories really speak to that which is most universal to the human heart. And those are lessons that we will constantly come back to as human beings. And it just reminds us of what's really important. And when we look at what's really important, it's our relationships with others. And of course, our relationships with others are the very reflection of our relationship with God.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. Oh, that's beautiful. So, going back to that idea of choosing books, what criteria do you use when you're choosing books, either for Beautiful Feet to publish or books that you just used as with your children when you were reading? Are there any, what would you say to somebody who's trying to kind of get their feet underneath them when it comes to choosing really good books?
Yeah. Well, have really good sources. So the very first thing I would recommend, of course, is, just like you do, read for the children's sake and read it over and over again.
Yes.
By Susan Schaefer Macaulay. And then always go to the library armed with either books children love or Honey for a Child's Heart. The criteria that we use at Beautiful Feet is literary beauty. So the book has to have beauty in terms of how the artist wrote it and their ability to speak to the human heart using the best words, the most concise language, and all of the incredible literary tropes and allusions and devices that make a book truly worthwhile. And I mean, C.S. Lewis said that, if a child's book cannot be enjoyed by an adult, it's not a good child's book either.
Right.
And, we sort of know that intuitively when we sit down with those wonderful classic children's books, whether it's the fairy tales of, the Grimm fairy tales or Andersen, we know that, we love reading those to our children because there's inherent beauty in the language. And then for us as, publishers, we always look for incredibly beautiful illustrations too, because when we first start presenting books to our children, we want their palette formed by beauty. And that, what Matthew Arnold described as the best that's been thought, the best thoughts of mankind. And that's what we want to form their palette with, because if we form their palette that way, they will never, I believe with all my heart, and I've seen this played out, they will never be entranced or enchanted by the tawdry and the banal and, just the ugliness that's out there, because their palette, that which satisfies their sort of spiritual, emotional palette has been formed with beautiful words and beautiful pictures and noble thought. And that is just such an incredible safeguard for our children as they go out into the world and are presented with just a smorgasbord of all that is tawdry in this world. And I think that notion of forming their palette. So when we publish books, we're always looking for visual and literary beauty, and that's what we focus on. And I think, when you look at the history of children's publishing, so much of that which was published, from the beginning of the 20th century through, the latter half, it was just a golden era of children's books. And there's just so many wonderful books that are now it's not that they've completely gone out of favor, but in the publishing world, unless a book sells something like 50,000 copies a year continually on the backlist, most publishers aren't interested in it. It's just not profitable to them. So there's all these little wonderful gems out there that, small people like my husband and I can come along and they sell a few thousand copies a year. And to us, that's, just restoring a treasure and keeping part of our literary heritage alive in these wonderful books.
Well, I completely can understand the idea of forming a child or, helping them cultivate a taste for good books. I think I've seen that in my oldest daughter, who's almost 14 now, and she has a pretty good discernment for good books. She'll ditch a book if it feels kind of twaddly. I almost don't have to do too much of the, discouraging if she picks up something twaddly, because I know she'll drop it by the first chapter. And then she'll go pick up something else, like Lucy Maud Montgomery or something. So she's been, I think, formed by enough really good stories that it's starting to shape, her kind of understanding of what's worth reading. So that's fun. I don't know if all my kids will have as much discernment, but it's been fun to watch with her.
Yes. We're starting to see some of the fruit of that, and that's such a beautiful, exciting thing to see.
Well, one of the things you recommend is starting history studies with American history, which is really interesting, especially considering right now there seems to be a trend in home education circles of people wanting to study history chronologically. So do you want to walk us through why you start with American history?
Okay, well, first of all, from a very practical sense, the very best children's books are about American history.
Yeah.
There aren't a lot of classic children's works about ancient history. And so what I've noticed with, a lot of this new generation with that sort of focus is that they've missed some of the very best children's books when their children are little and when they are most appropriate for those ages. And so that from a very practical perspective, that's the most important, I think, is that if you're not focusing on early American history when your children are little, you're going to miss just a wealth of beautiful books for your children. So, but really from a child development perspective, I think it's important to look at child development experts really believe that the human brain grows and is developed intellectually in gradually expanding, concentric circles. So just as, we first start nursing our infants, we are their whole world. And then eventually, daddy starts to come into that world and then their siblings and their understanding of the world develops that way, even as they emerge into early grammar school. They are still learning the world in these expanding concentric circles. And so, if anyone's kind of interested in this from just sort of a scientific perspective, I would recommend the works of Jean Piaget, the French philosopher. And really, he was the one that really studied how the child brain develops. And so our child, emerges into this world of the nuclear family, and then that world is expanded by the grandparents and the aunts and uncles and the cousins, and then eventually the church community or their school community, and then their larger community, and then their identity as the citizen of a nation. And so for us, from, a simple, childhood development perspective, it's just in keeping with what scientists understand about how the brain learns. And so I think also that because what we really want is our children to respond to these stories, in a very vicarious way. We want them to relate to these characters that they're, the Washingtons and the Lincolns and the Benjamin Franklins and, the forefathers of history of their country. Once they come to know and love those figures and appreciate them and look up to them, then they're able to more realistically understand and relate to a larger world scene. So I think that, this isn't a hard and fast rule, but I think that it tends to work better for young children to learn about the history of their own country first. And then once they know and love their own country, then they can know and love the histories of other countries. And so that's kind of been how we've felt like you can best develop this love of history. And it seems to have worked really well over the last 3 decades that we've been doing this.
Yeah. Another one of the homeschool mom mentors that I really look up to is Laura Berquist at Mother of Divine Grace School. And this is something she recommends as well, to start with the nation, start with your child's own nation. And I think it's the same concept of the best children's literature. Really, the best children's American history literature is like the Dallaire books, like the ones that you publish. And those may not appeal to your middle schooler. So if you wait until they're middle school before you get to that age, you've kind of missed the window for that book to really have the same kind of impact on them.
Yeah, and I think that's really true because, again, we want our children, especially when they're in those tender years, we want the books that speak most powerfully to them. Now, as far as ancient history, first of all, there isn't a single classic children's picture book that's ever won a single award, that's ever been acknowledged to be of extraordinary literary beauty for a primary student.
Wow, I did not realize that. Okay.
No, they don't exist. Now, one of the classics of ancient children's literature is the work of Padraic Colum, The Children's Homer.
Oh, yes. Okay.
So Padraic Colum was an Irish man of letters, a poet, and a total wordsmith. And he knew the value of the Iliad and the Odyssey, and so he wanted to write a children's version of it. And so he did The Children's Homer. And it's beautiful. The illustrations are beautiful. But you couldn't read that book to a primary child. That book is for an intermediate to junior high-level child.
Okay.
And just the concepts are too complex and all of that. So there really is nothing like that for a primary age student either. So you really forego this notion of really concentrating on literary beauty and gorgeous picture books if you want to teach chronologically. You really do forego that. And I think then you're just using sort of mediocre books. And remember, this is when your child is learning to love books.
Yeah, right.
You're using all mediocre literature and you're not really teaching history. So it's a bit of a misnomer. You're teaching cultural studies because there aren't any really great books on the history of Greece and the history of Rome for primary children. So you're teaching pyramids and you're teaching mummies and you're teaching chariots. And so you're really not doing history either. You're doing cultural studies. So it's just a bit of a misnomer. And it's
a very good point. I hadn't thought of it that way. That's a great point.
Well, and it's never been done in history. This notion of teaching chronologically is a brand new paradigm. And so I think if people understood that, they wouldn't be so convinced immediately that, this is the best, this makes total sense. So I think, if you look at it historically, history has never been taught this way.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think Memoria Press, and we'll link this in the show notes, but they have this great post titled "History is Not Chronological," and it's really it kind of turns that whole idea.
Oh, I'm gonna have to look at that. That sounds great.
Yeah, I'll send you a link. It's pretty great.
Okay.
Okay, so the way that many of us were taught history in school included like a lot of dates and memorization, and that's also the way a lot of us teach our kids various subjects, not just history. But I'm curious to know what your thoughts are on memory work and memorizing dates and facts.
Well, I think memorization is one of the extraordinary, faculties of the human mind. I mean, it's really quite something what people can memorize. And, oh my goodness, when you look at the histories of some of the great leaders and thinkers, like Abraham Lincoln and Winston Churchill, their capacity and their ability to memorize was extraordinary. The difference between the educational culture right now and those great leaders who achieved amazing feats in history was the content. None of those leaders ever memorized dates and facts, ever.
Okay.
But they would memorize, Winston Churchill would memorize whole chapters of classic literature.
Right.
And,
okay.
And poetry that was, it's extraordinary. So we have this amazing faculty for memorization, and yet we're just putting meaningless dates and facts and times in our child's brain when they could be memorizing. And really, scripture, the power of memorizing scripture is so extraordinary. Those scriptures that you memorize as a child will stay with you your entire life. And sometimes they will mean the difference between life and death in your emotional health and in some of the things that you have to face in your life. the power of memorizing poetry. I mean, it's extraordinary how poetry can speak to us. Poetry speaks to us in a way nothing else can. And I mean, that's one of the reasons memorizing scripture is so powerful, because much of it is poetry.
Right, right. This is actually really affirming for me, because since we've had, well, about 2 years ago, we had 3 babies in 2 years. We had a baby who was 9 months old, and then we got pregnant with twins. So it's baby. And we had 3 older yes. And we had 3 older kids who were homeschooling. And so at the time, I had this sort of frightfully ambitious list of things I wanted my kids to memorize. But because God sent all these beautiful babies to us, our time was extremely limited. And so what I ended up doing was paring down our memory work to just beautiful language, because I thought, okay, we only have a certain amount of time. So the most important thing I want is, and I would pare it down to mostly scripture and poetry and sometimes beautiful passages from literature. And we've kind of just kept on with that. And I've never really brought the facts back in. And now I'm thinking, I think we'll just keep on doing what we've been doing then.
Oh, that's so wonderful. Yes. Wasn't that a delightful diversion that God gave you?
Isn't that great? Yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
We think the babies and toddlers are getting in the way, but actually they're refining us, and
yeah. Oh, that's just wonderful. What a great story. Well, I just think about, especially for children, they have such a delightful sense of humor. What a wonderful time in their lives to teach them the crazy limericks of Edward Lear, or, memorizing the poetry of Shel Silverstein. I mean, how fun. What a great way to bring humor into your daily routine, and the levity of some of these amazing poets who bring humor, and just, and that was one of the things that was so life-saving for Lincoln, because Lincoln had that very melancholy disposition, and he was given to deep, dark depressions. And when you look at his life, it was so tragic. I mean, his very first love, Anne Rutledge, dies when they're teens, and then shortly after that, his only sibling dies in childbirth. His mother died when he was 9 or 10 years old. So the 3 significant women in his life all died at a very young age. So he had this tremendous capacity for melancholy and depression. But it was humor that saved him. And even like his chief of staff and stuff, they would get so frustrated with him as president because, they were in the darkest days of the Civil War, and he would come into the office and he would begin the day by, a humorous anecdote. And I think it was Stanton at one point that said, "Will you just stop the stupid jokes?" I mean, and Lincoln just said, "If I didn't laugh, I would weep." And it was just like the incredible redemptive power of laughter when we're going through, here is a man who suffered such anguish, and then he lost his beloved son while he was in the White House, and you just look at a life that is just beset by so much tragedy and heartache and loss, and yet he learned the power of humor, and I think that's something that we sometimes really miss in our homeschool day, especially if we are so consumed with this notion of academic excellence. And sometimes I think as mothers, we really have to look at our own heart, and we have to evaluate, what is my purpose and what is my motive? Is it because I feel like I didn't get the education I deserved or I should have gotten, or I feel inadequate in my education that, I've got to make my children into academic superstars so that I can sort of live vicariously through them, if I can somehow be successful through them? And I think we really have to put those are little demons that will really rob us of, the beauty of what it means to be a mom and what it means to really nurture our children. And I think those are things that we need to be aware of, our potential, just potential little foxes in our lives that can really spoil the fruit, and to really look at those. So when I'm talking about memorization, I'm thinking this is an incredible faculty and power of the human mind, but let's use it for that which is really life-giving. And that was one of the things that Lincoln did. He had long passages of Shakespeare by heart. And even, there's a beautiful story in one of the books we published called Abraham Lincoln by James Dougherty. And there's a beautiful story of after the fall of Richmond, and Lincoln is on one of the steamships going back to D.C., traveling along the Potomac River there. And, he's just had this incredible victory. The Civil War is over. And he's in the steamboat and he's reading Shakespeare to his staff and his wife. And I just love the vision of that because he was talking about that passage in Shakespeare about, the kings. I think he was reading either Macbeth or King Lear. I can't remember right now. But he clearly had some sort of foresight into, the nature of power and, how kings can lose their thrones in a moment. And he had this premonition that he wasn't going to live long. And you feel that coming through as he's reciting this, this play of Shakespeare's. And I would have loved to be a fly on the wall at that moment and just imagine that scene with his sort of lovely kind of Southern drawl, reading Shakespeare, this incredibly poetic person, and how beautifully that spoke to him at that moment in time. And, we have that legacy of his as, just one of our incredible forefathers. And so it's so neat to have that connection and to think how he had that connection with Shakespeare and how that spoke to him at an important moment in his life.
Oh, that's beautiful. Yeah, that's good. Those are the kind of stories we need to have to kind of spur us on when we start doubting ourselves, I think.
Yes, yeah, because, literature, the very best literature has such eternal lessons. And I think that's the other thing why really forming our children's palate with the very best books, it immediately at the most tender age connects them to something much bigger than themselves. And that's why, you have those golden years with your children where they're just like sponges, just soaking everything up. And you want to really capture that because it's such a sweet time, for mom and dad reading to their children on their lap. It's such a cozy, intimate time. And at that time, you want to really utilize it to its maximum capacity and benefit. And I think when you're reading the very best books, you are. And I think it's such an antidote for the narcissism of our age because, when you look at so many young people now and the culture we have of, just a little Hollywood stardom and the sports stardom, we live in a very narcissistic age. And the beauty of the best book is it connects us to something so much more transcendent than that and so much bigger than ourselves. And there's a great line in To Kill a Mockingbird where Miss Maudie is talking to Scout and she's talking about talents. And, she says something like, only a crazy person takes pride in their own talents. And yet, we live in a culture that's what we idolize.
Yeah.
People that have talents.
Yeah.
Whether it's the completely unearned
talent, like beauty or something that's
physical beauty, yes, right. Or the talent of sports. I mean, sports, yes, you have to nurture that talent, you have to refine it, you have to work it, but it's still a talent. It's still a God-given ability. Like you don't earn the body you're given. You're given this body, and this body may be skilled at something and may be designed just right to throw the perfect pass. But that's not anything you earned. And yet we live in a culture where people take so much credit for their own talents and their own giftings. And it's really tragic because those are the people that are on pedestals in our culture. And that's why I think, the best literature helps our children to not fall into that sort of narcissistic thing like, oh, I'm so good at this. Aren't I something?
It helps them see. I think one of the things that really helps my kids see, and me too, honestly, is we kind of get wrapped up in our own little world, especially as homeschoolers. I don't know, my little inconveniences or frustrations at home will blow up in my mind to these big, massive problems. And then it's a story where you hear about the bravery of the boy in the matchlock gun or, Washington crossing the Delaware that you go, oh, wait a second, I'm just this small piece of this big, big story.
Yes, I think it really helps us see ourselves in perspective. And I think that's the beauty of it because we're all given to hubris. We're all given to pride. This is, our Achilles heel in our human nature that, we will fall to that, given half a second, we will fall to that. And I think it's so beautiful. And, I think it's the other thing that I think is so important when we're reading to our children is they learn appropriate human emotions as they watch us respond to literature. And, I think that is such a powerful lesson, because when there's a moment in which it is so moving what has just happened that as we're reading, we're choked up and we can't continue the story. And we have to stop because our voice is breaking and tears are coming to our eyes, and our children learn, oh, there's something here. And I remember, and not every child reacts emotionally to literature. Children react in different ways. But one of our children seemed to always be pretty stalwart, and, we'd all sort of be choked up. And if I was reading, I'd have to pass the book to my husband because I'd just be choked up. And then he would keep reading and he'd get choked up and he'd have to try to pass it to one of the kids. But our son this one son just didn't seem to affect him quite as much. And so, you always wonder, what is that point at which there's a little bit of a break in that, whatever that armor is or whatever that vulnerability is, how do you reach that vulnerable place? Because we all have different vulnerabilities, right? And so for this child, it happened to be the first time he really saw racism for what it was through the pages of a book. So he was 15 years old, and he was reading Roll of Thunder, Hear My Cry, and Let the Circle Be Unbroken. And I think he was actually on the third one of that trilogy. And I was standing in the kitchen cooking dinner, and he came in, and he was bawling. And this was a child that just didn't bawl his eyes out. And his question was, oh my gosh, Mom, how can people treat others this way? And, that was that epiphany for him and that moment of catharsis, which is what the very best books do. And again, just like Atticus Finch says in To Kill a Mockingbird, it's that walking in another man's shoes and being able to empathize and feel their pain that, that breaks us out of our sort of prisons. William Kilpatrick calls it our prison houses of self-absorption. I mean, what better tool do we have in our tool chest?
Yeah, right.
Literature to do that.
Right. And it helps because as a parent, I feel like I do so much of that kind of directing the way I want my children to think or feel. But when you use a book to do that, instead, you get to step out of the way completely and let the book do that work on a child's heart, I think.
You're so right. And that's so wise of you as a young mom, because I think it's easy for us to fall into kind of, plying our children with questions. And rather than just sort of letting the book speak to them and letting what the characters are going through speak to them. And, it's not something that happens overnight. It's something that happens over years of investment and over years of pouring into our children's lives in this way. And, and it's such a joy now to watch my children be parents and watch how they're just taking so many of those lessons that they learned as children from the best books that they read and reapplying them in their children's lives. So we're seeing that second generation of those priceless lessons that they learned and the joy that they're getting out of being able to now share those things with their children. So It's really a multi-generational thing. I sort of speak to that scripture, His truth endures to all generations. And wow, what a beautiful thing that we get to be part of that generational passing on of that legacy and passing on of that truth and acquainting ourselves with, the best books, but the books that have been seminal in American culture, the Kill a Mockingbirds and the Uncle Tom's Cabins and the books of Mark Twain, because those things spoke to particular issues of our culture. Now, they speak to universal themes, but through the venue of the issues that our particular culture has dealt with. And, of course, the whole issue of racism has been really a defining part of American history, and it still continues to be. Yeah. When you look at what just happened in South Carolina, you realize this is still a defining issue. We have to be constantly evaluating our worldview and our own particular, because we all have our own little cultural prejudices, and sometimes we don't even realize they're there. But literature can help us see those things and can help us work through them.
Well, unfortunately, we're almost out of time, and this has been such a wonderful conversation. But before I let you go, I am curious to know which book most shaped you as you were growing up.
Well, like I said, I wasn't raised in a literary home, but I think, oh gosh, it's so hard. It really is so hard to point to one book. But I think one of the books that I read as a teen that I really felt opened my mind in a way Well, you know what I like to think of is the words of C.S. Lewis, where he calls it the baptism of the imagination. And I would say A Wrinkle in Time really baptized my imagination. You know, we're talking about the cultural issues of our day, and again, C.S. Lewis talks about, you know, the baptism of imagination, but he also talks about this notion of don't read more than one contemporary book more than one out of every three books, because every society is subject to its own blindness. And if we read the old books, those will help us to see our own cultural blindness. And, you know, one book that I would really recommend, especially for this generation of home educators, is Charles Dickens' Hard Times.
I have not read that, actually. Okay.
Okay. Well, that's a book where he really tries to expose the mechanization of education. And because of the Industrial Revolution and the wonders of what industrialization brought to humankind, educators thought, well, this is what we need for education, too. So there became a real emphasis on making education devoid of any kind of emotion, because emotion wasn't scientific. And so, you know, when you read Plato, when you read Charlotte Mason, it's just like there is no true education without the emotional component. But now there are certain paradigms where you're again divorcing it from emotion. So if there isn't something that resonates in the human heart with what we're reading, and there isn't some sort of emotional response, then we probably need to kind of reevaluate. So Hard Times by Charles Dickens would be a great read for parents, just to really look at how education became mechanized and to the demise of society.
Okay, I'll put it on my list for this summer.
Some of that. Yeah, good.
This has been wonderful. So for all of our listeners, if you are really interested in teaching your children through literature, you really can't get any better than what Rea and her team creates there at Beautiful Feet Books. And you can find them at bfbooks.com. They have literature packs for all different time periods in history. They also have a literature pack for history through science, which is really appealing to me. And one that I want to get my hands on soon is the history of classical music through literature. That looks fantastic, Rea.
Oh, thank you. Well, it's been delightful spending this time with you, Sarah. Thank you so much.
Now it's time for Let the Kids Speak. This is my favorite part of the podcast, where kids tell us about their favorite stories that have been read aloud to them.
My name is Grace Pitts, and I live in Texas. My favorite book to hear read aloud is The Prairie Thief. It is about a girl named Louisa. My favorite part is when Louisa meets the brownie. Hi, my name is Jack. I'm from Pennsylvania. I'm 5 years old. My favorite book right now is The Magic Traps, Book 45, A Crazy Day with Cobras by Mary Pope Osborne. My favorite part is when Jack and Annie get to the Emerald Rose out of the cobra's nest. It was really fun to read. Hi, my name is Kate. I'm 3 years old. I'm from Pennsylvania. My favorite book is Western Street. I Can Do It. My favorite part is when Elmo learns to swim. I love to read. Hi, my name is Jocelyn. I'm 5 years old. I live in Nebraska. And I want to recommend to teach for 100 years by Rachel Field. I like it because it's written from the perspective of an antique doll. She goes all over the world and has lots of adventures. My favorite character is Phoebe Preble, her first owner. And she gets lots more owners throughout the story. Hello, I'm James. And where I live is Alaska. And my favorite book is Waynetta and the Cornstalk. And how old I am is 5 years old. My favorite part is where Waynetta's mom throws the magic corn out the window.
Awesome. Thank you, kids. I always love to hear from you. Okay, if you're a homeschooling parent, listen up because I made something for you that you don't want to miss, and it's free. You know how when you're having a really hard day in your homeschool, I don't know, the toddler's melting down, kids are whining, the house is a mess, you have this all-consuming, completely overwhelming sense of, I am a complete and utter failure? Well, in those moments, when that happens to me, I always want to ask my favorite homeschooling mentors for their best advice, a single tip or a nugget of wisdom that would help me decide what's the most important thing to focus on in that moment, and maybe how I can simplify or what I can shuck from my overcrowded schedule. So I thought to myself, I'm sure that we all feel this way on our hard days. And so I just asked them. I asked some of my favorite homeschooling mentors, and the likelihood is that some of them are your favorites too. Andrew Kern, Julie Bogart, Susan Wise-Bauer, Lila Lawler, Andrew Pudua, Cindy Rollins, Sonia Schaefer, Janice Campbell, and our guest today, Rea Berg. I asked each one of them what a single golden tip for an overwhelmed homeschooling mom would be. And then I collected their answers into a handy little downloadable so you could print it out and keep it nearby on those days when you feel like throwing in the towel. I'm telling you, I got your back. So if you want to grab that downloadable, it's totally, completely free. You can head to today's show notes to grab it. Go to readaloudrevival.com. Look for episode 31. There you'll find the download where you can grab it. And I want to know, after you get it, tell me which of their tips was the most helpful to you, because I'm completely curious. You can leave a comment in the show notes, or you can send me an email and let me know. I'd love to hear it. Again, that's readaloudrevival.com, episode number 31 to grab that download. Well, that's it for today. So I will talk to you again in a couple of weeks. Hey, for episode 32 of the podcast, my favorite sidekick, Courtney, and I are going to be chatting up all the questions we've been getting in the inbox. If you've ever written into the Read Aloud Revival, you have probably met Courtney because she is the lovely lady on the other side of the screen. She and I are going to be answering a lot of questions we see in the private Facebook group, in the membership site, in our email inboxes, and we're going to be taking those on in the next episode. Super fun. So I'll see you next time. And hey, until then, go build your family culture around books.